Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you today. And, it's fun to hear that I'm on the hit list. I think I'm on various hit lists around the place. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for the kind invitation. I'm delighted I was able to make it work. And my presence here is not entirely altruistic. My son lives in Reston, Virginia, so looking forward to spending today and tomorrow worshiping with my son at McLean Presbyterian Church is where he worships. He's not an Anglican. But as you hear, I've been on an Anglican kick this week, and a number of people asked me to bring greetings to Anglicans for Life. I believe normally the two conferences don't sort of collide, so but Foley Beach sends his regards. Father Calvin Robinson from my own home country, England, sends his kind regards and best wishes to you all. My own work, for those of you who've read, if you've read either of my books, my own work doesn't really focus on pro-life stuff, but I've become aware since they were published that there's a huge overlap. I first became, I suppose, most aware of it when Alexandra de Sanctis, who I think is one of the rising voices in the pro-life movement, dropped me a note about my work some years ago. And since then, we wrote a short piece, Are Women Still Human?, together, addressing relations of selfhood and abortion. And she really drew my attention to the fact that some of the things that I was saying about particularly my interest lie in the LGBTQ plus movement. Some of the things I was saying about the context in which that movement has become plausible apply to the same kind of culture in which abortion is, I would say, not merely plausible, but has also come to be seen as a virtue. And after I'd engaged in this dialogue with Zan, I was reading Oliver O'Donovan's wonderful little book, Begotten Not Made. If you've never read it, it's about 70 or 80 pages long. It was phenomenally expensive from Oxford University Press, but the Davenant Institute have reprinted it in a cheap paperback form. If you haven't read Oliver O'Donovan's Begotten Not Made, it is well worth getting hold of. It's a collection of his essays, really, that he wrote in the 1980s. Dealing particularly with issues surrounding in vitro fertilization, those kind of things. But one of the essays he wrote there had a passage in it that really caught my eye as I was reading it. And his comment was to the effect that he had been wrong-footed in the 1960s. And he's, of course, a British academic writing about the political debates surrounding abortion in Britain, not America, so there are certainly procedural differences in the way the debate played out. It was legislated in Britain by Parliament, not by the law lords. He made the comment that intrigued me there, that the thing that struck him most as he looked back from the perspective of the 1980s to the 1960s when he was engaged in the pro-life movement, the thing that struck him most was this, that the weakest argument of the pro-abortion lobby, that as a philosopher and ethicist he hadn't even considered worthy of response, had proved to be the strongest argument in the pro-abortion arsenal. And that intrigued him. And of course, the weakest argument, the one that he felt was unworthy of being addressed philosophically, the weakest argument was that the baby in the womb is only part of the woman's body. He didn't consider that even really worthy of a response. He felt it was so intellectually vacuous as a claim. And what had stunned him was that claim became, the ace in the hole, if you like, of the pro-abortion movement. And he went on to reflect on that. He asked himself, well, why is this the case? And his answer was that argument may be philosophically incoherent from his perspective, but it actually chimed with some of the deepest cultural intuitions that now grip the imagination of the West. And that touched really, it reminded me to some extent of my thinking about the LGBTQ stuff, particularly the T, the trans issue. I was at university in the 1980s. I did classics, but of course, classics, you do literature, you do history. I was very familiar with kind of critical theory stuff from lectures and from supervisions I had at university. And of all the branches of critical theory that struck me as the least plausible, radical queer and gender theory struck me as self-evident nonsense. I have, if you like, a parallel experience now to Oliver O'Donovan, in that why is it that these, I think, most facile branches of critical theory have become so dominant? And that was kind of in the background of the stuff that I wrote on the LGBTQ stuff. And my answer was, these theories chime with some of the deepest intuitions that are now deeply ingrained in the West, in the way we intuitively think. The battle, if you like, today is not so much for the mind as it is for the imagination. And so I want to talk really today in this first session about the forces that have come to create what Charles Taylor refers to as the modern social imaginary. It's a very ugly phrase, I think, social imaginary, because he uses an adjective as a noun. We use imaginary to refer to, unicorns are imaginary creatures. He's really using imaginary to mean imagination. Why on earth he makes that switch, I don't know. But I want to talk about what has formed the social imaginary. And the point of the social imaginary is this. When Charles Taylor talks, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor talks about the social imaginary, he's trying to get at the fact that the way most of us think about the most important questions of life, in general, does not track back to arguments we've read and been persuaded by. It connects to intuitions, social practices, the way we, if you like, the way that we imagine the world to be. Simple example, why do we believe stealing is wrong? Well, very few of us have read the great canonical texts of ethics. Maybe some of us have read Aristotle. Perhaps a few, but not many, have read Kant. Groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Most of us think stealing is wrong because our mother told us it was wrong. And we grew up in an environment where there were all kinds of things that militated against stealing. We have no grand ethical theory about stealing. We just intuitively know that it's wrong. And Charles Taylor thinks that the way we think about the big questions of life often tracks back to that. And I would use, gay marriage as an example. I remember in the run-up to the Supreme Court judgment of 2015, I was teaching at a seminary at the time, occasionally students would ask me, are there good arguments against gay marriage? My answer would always be, there are many good arguments against gay marriage, but it's pointless me teaching them to you because the issue will not be won on the basis of argument. The issue will be won on the basis of how people feel about the issue. And my comment way back then would be, will and grace, far more important than any of the great texts, pro or con, that have been written relative to gay marriage. That's the social imaginary at work, if you like, the way our intuitions are shaped. So I want to suggest in this first talk, and by the way, just to give you the map, the second talk, what I'm going to do is sort of come at the same material, but from a different angle in order to think about a church response. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but I am going to, in the second talk, touch on the same topics, but from a different angle, from a sort of synthetic rather than historical angle, in order for us to think about how the church might respond to the questions we're facing. So why does the pro-abortion argument resonate so deeply? Well, I think it connects with the basic anthropology that grips our culture's imagination. In other words, the cultural tide, the imagination is flowing in favor of the case for abortion. And that anthropology, that understanding of what it means to be a human being, roots truth in subjective feelings rather than reason. And I think we see this in the way the discussion has pivoted since the fall of Roe v. Wade. I think it was, stepping aside from any moral stance I might take on the issue, I think pivoting to narrative stories of young girls who've been raped and can't get abortions, that's a brilliant move by the pro-abortion lobby because it strikes at our heartstrings. I was a pastor for some 6 years in Philadelphia, and praise God, I never had a situation where a father brought a young girl into my office and said, my daughter's been raped, she's pregnant, can she get an abortion? Had I been faced with that situation, I know what answer I would have given, but I'd be lying to say that it would not have been agony to give that answer. It would have been deeply difficult to give the right answer. I pray that I would have done so. But we're creatures of feeling. So often when we talk ethically, we deal in abstractions. But when you're confronted with the face of somebody, a face is not an abstraction. A face is an individual person with a history. And that has a different emotional register to the kind of more abstract arguments one can have in a lecture theatre. So I think the pro-abortion argument chimes with the basic anthropological direction of our culture's imagination, and that anthropology roots itself in feeling rather than reason. So what is that anthropology? By the way, I would recommend to you, if you've not read it before, and I'm sure most, if not all of you have, C.S. Lewis's little book, The Abolition of Man, delivered as lectures in 1943, just over 80 years ago. In many ways, much of what I say today was clearly anticipated and articulated by C.S. Lewis in the 1940s. What is the basic anthropology of the day? The basic anthropology of the day is this, that the self, the individual, is free and unencumbered. That what makes us human is our freedom, our autonomy. That has implications, some of which we will look at in more detail in the second lecture. But one of the things it does is this. It tilts us towards thinking of all relations with others in contractual terms. We will tend to look at relations, when we think of ourselves as free, fundamentally free and defined by our freedom, we will tend to look at other relations in terms of whether they help us enhance our freedom or whether they act to inhibit our freedom. And that is a deep cultural intuition today. It's articulated, I think, most powerfully in the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. Rousseau, and again I will return to this statement in my second lecture, but Rousseau, one could summarize his thinking about what it means to be human in the great phrase with which he begins the social contract. Man is born free, and everywhere is in chains. That has become, if you like, the intuitive mantra, I think, of the modern West. It's interesting, of course, that Rousseau engaged in what I would regard as functional infanticide. He lived with a woman, I don't think they were ever formally married, but he lived pretty faithfully with a woman for many, many years, and she had 5 children. And Rousseau had all 5 of them sent to an orphanage shortly after birth. Now, an 18th century orphanage, that's a death sentence. The likelihood is that all 5 of those children died. It makes perfect sense, of course, if you think you're born free and everywhere placed in chains. Because what does a child become in that particular context? A child becomes a link in a chain. A child connotes responsibilities and obligations that tie you down. Just as an interesting sort of fact of history, it's his great rival Voltaire who blows the whistle on this. Voltaire exposes Rousseau as a functional infanticide. So Rousseau has to address it in public, and if you read his autobiography, The Confessions, it's kind of blink and you'll miss it moment. He addresses it in just a couple of sentences and says that he was convinced that the orphanage would be a better father to his children than he would. If he really thought that, then he had a very, very low opinion of his own parental abilities, I would suggest. Well, think about how that logic applies to today's debates about abortion. The child in the womb, read through the grid of autonomy, the question is, does that child enhance or hinder my freedom or happiness? That's the kind of intellectual rationale that Oliver O'Donovan sees percolating down through society that really makes that statement, the baby's just part of my body, plausible. So that's the first thing to note. Secondly, one of the things we should note about the last few hundred years is this, that there's been an increasing emphasis upon feelings as defining who we are. We see this most dramatically, perhaps, in marriage laws. One of the interesting things about the modern marriage debate is how much focus there is on the happiness of the contracting parties. I think it's the case that we actually don't have, or didn't originally have, marriage laws to handle the happiness of those involved. We had marriage laws to protect women, and above all, to protect children. In which case, you don't need gay marriage because by definition, gay marriage is a sterile union. There is no risk of pregnancy, as I understand it, from a gay marriage, and therefore one would not need gay marriage laws because there are no children to protect in that context. But think about the shift from marriage as protecting children to marriage as protecting happiness for the contracting parties. That connotes a world where personal happiness and feelings of well-being are moving to the center of what it means to live a properly fulfilled life. And that's why I agree with Robert George, as if I would ever dare disagree with Robert George. It's one of the reasons, other than the fact I'm frightened of him, so I'd always agree with him. It's one of the reasons I agree with Robert George that the key move in the marriage debate in the United States is not 2015, when Obergefell v. Hodges is decided by the Supreme Court. It's actually 1969, 1970, when Ronald Reagan, governor of California, signs into law no-fault divorce law. That's the key redefinition of marriage. When the union of marriage is to last only as long as it provides personal satisfaction to the two contracting parties. And when children are just so much collateral damage to be dealt with after the divorce has been approved, that's the redefinition of marriage. Once marriage is a sentimental bond and nothing to do with children, it's been redefined. It's been redefined. That's also a hint as to how long a lot of this stuff has been going on. I think a lot of Christians have been very shocked at the speed, and I would say the accelerating speed of the sex and gender revolution. When you think 2015 it's coming up 9 years ago, but it seems like an eternity ago in many ways. So gay marriage now seems a pretty conservative debate to be having compared to many of the debates we're having at this current moment in time. In actual fact, the causes of this go back a long, long way. As I say, we see Rousseau articulating this notion of autonomy and the emergence of feelings as important is central to the whole debate. We see that in the 18th century. Interesting enough, we see it across the board in the 18th century. I picked on Rousseau, but of course, at the same time as Rousseau is reflecting on the status of inner feelings in, I was going to say America, but it's actually the colonies at the time. It's not America. The British, not American theologian, Jonathan Edwards, he would have thought of himself as British, not American. Jonathan Edwards is writing the religious affections. What's he doing? He's wrestling with the status of feelings and what authority they should be granted in terms of how we think about ourselves and the world around us. The difference between Rousseau and Edwards, of course, is Edwards wants to bring his inner feelings ultimately under the external authority of divine revelation. For Rousseau, really those feelings take on a life and an authority of their own. So how has this come about? How have we got to the situation where feelings have become so important? Well, there's an intellectual genealogy. I mentioned Rousseau. One could also move on into the 19th century and look at Romanticism. If you like music, if you listen to the late string quartets of Beethoven, something interesting is going on there. If you listen to Mozart's music and then you listen to the later Beethoven, you can tell there's been an important shift taking place here. If you contrast Bach with Beethoven, you see it in even more dramatic form. The kind of structure and order that we find in, say, a Bach is really starting to crumble at the hands of Beethoven. Beethoven is striving to do something that the old forms can't accommodate. Well, what's he trying to do? I would say one of the things he's trying to do is he's trying to hit the heart. And let me say, I love the Romantics, I love romantic music, I love romantic poetry. That's not a bad thing. Don't listen to my talk and come away thinking Trueman thinks feelings are a bad thing. Psalms are full of feelings. I'm English, so I don't have many feelings myself, but those I do have, I appreciate. There's something beautiful in what Beethoven is doing, but it is different. It is different. There's an appeal to the emotions going. The emotions are becoming more and more important. The other week, just 2 weeks ago, my wife and I, we took a break and went to London for the week. I wanted to catch a show, wanted to visit a few galleries and just hang out in London, get away from it all. And we went to Tate Britain, one of the galleries in London, because there they have the Turner, the sort of the permanent JMW Turner exhibition. And it's fascinating looking at Turner's paintings. You go from he's a genius. You go from these early days. By the time he's 18, he's already making a name. And then you go all the way through to his old age. And you can see the transformation in the style of his painting. At the end, the sunsets he's painting are just these explosions. You almost feel if you switch the light off, the painting would still glow. I don't know how they project that kind of light just from paint. But you see there a kind of romantic move in Turner. He's not presenting nature, we might say, as a photograph would present it. He's presenting nature, he's presenting those sunsets as he feels them in his heart. And that's part of being human, of course. Who of us has not gone up a great mountain or seen a great sunset and looked at it and been affected in our souls, felt something that a mere photograph would not capture? We can look at poetry and see the same thing. It's appeal to feelings. But what prevents this romantic move from chaos is this. All of these great artists and thinkers still thought there was such a thing as human nature. They still thought there was something stable there that kind of regulated everything. What has changed, I think, in the later 19th century was feelings became unhitched from any stable constant. You see this For example, in the philosophical work of Friedrich Nietzsche, we'll return to Nietzsche in the second lecture. But one of the things that Nietzsche sees morality as doing is curbing instinct, preventing us from being who we really are, stopping us from acting on our desires. What emerges in the late 19th century really is the loss of that which keeps feelings regulated. Even Rousseau believes kind of human nature. His view of God may be very attenuated, but he still believes that human beings have a natural empathy for each other. That will all get scrambled in the 19th century. The second dimension to this as well is that when you start to prioritize feelings, the body starts to become a problem. I'm going to return to this in the second lecture. But think about that. Again, go back to the intuitions of the day. I would say today, one of the strange aspects of our culture today is that our bodies have become problematic to us. The most obvious example would be the transgender question. And please don't hear me as dismissing the genuine pain and struggle of those who are afflicted with gender dysphoria. I don't wish to belittle that. But it fascinates me that we have this rapid onset gender dysphoria, particularly affecting young girls. Particularly affecting young girls, going through puberty, struggling with their bodies. The body is a problem to them. We've actually had an analog 20, 30 years ago. I think anorexia and bulimia were the historic analogs to rapid onset gender dysphoria. The difference is, of course, everybody knew that was a problem. They knew it was insane to tell a 40-pound girl that she was, yes, a fat person, trapped in just what showed itself as a thin body, and therefore she needed to starve herself further. We knew that was madness, and we were able to overcome it. Can't do that, sadly, today with the latest phenomena. But we have shifted towards a disembodied view of personhood, where embodiment has become a problem. And again, I will return to this in more detail in the second lecture. But that connects to the abortion debate, does it not? Where women's natural bodily functions, pregnancy, for example, becomes a problem to be overcome, not something necessarily to be embraced and accepted. So the downplaying of the body becomes an appendage to the person. How is this filtered down? Okay, not many people read Nietzsche, not many people read gender theory. How has this become part of the intuitions of our day? A number of things. One, technology. Technology encourages us to think of ourselves as disembodied. Don't want to criticize beaming somebody in who couldn't get out of Florida yesterday. That's not what I want to say here at all. But think of how much of our personal interaction today is mediated through technology rather than direct face-to-face. One of the things that drives my wife absolutely nuts is we'll go out every now and then for a nice meal somewhere, sitting in a restaurant. Two different things drive us nuts. We'll look across and you'll see a couple who've gone out for an expensive meal. What drives me nuts is the guy's wearing a baseball cap. What do you want to? Why do you want to dress up nice for your wife? Why wear and if it's reversed, that's the absolute end as far as I'm concerned. But what drives my wife crazy is couples going out for dinner and sitting looking at their cell phones rather than interacting with each other. Bodily presence seems to become less important. Technology has attenuated the significance of our bodies. The person has come to be thought of as something that dwells within the body and for which the body is a problem or a limitation. Again, I know that all of you here are very interested in the legal debates that have swirled around abortion. If you've not read it, check out the amicus brief filed in the Dobbs case by the professional women athletes of the United States of America. It's a very interesting brief. I am incapable of commenting on the legal plausibility of the arguments it makes from the perspective of law. What interests me is the language that these women athletes use about their bodies. Their bodies are not them. They talk about their bodies as tools. They're tools that allow them to become them. It's weird. Except it isn't weird today. People would read that and would not see it as weird. But I would say it is weird when we come to think of our bodies not as ourselves, but as some instrument that allows us to become ourselves. We should not talk about our bodies as a carpenter would talk about a saw, or a plumber would talk about a wrench. And yet that's how these women talk about their bodies. And then, of course, bodily functions become problematic when they frustrate the inner sense of self that these women have. Pregnancy becomes a real problem at that point because the real them is the athlete. And when the body gets pregnant, well, that's an alien intrusion and limitation upon who they actually are. The person is thought of as disembodied, and the body and its limitations or natural functions become problematic. Think about the culture industry. Think about how the cultural industry presses on us the notion of freedom, autonomy, the cult of youthful wisdom and innocence. Rousseau's notion that it's society that screws you up because you are a free and autonomous person. How often is that reinforced by the culture industry? I had a student a couple of years ago do a very interesting, she chose the paper. The paper she did for me was on Hollywood movies where parents apologize to children, and Hollywood movies where children apologize to parents. Almost no Hollywood movies are produced today, apparently, where children apologize to parents. They're all about parents apologizing to children. Think about the philosophical message that sends. The children are the font of all wisdom, and parents just screw them up. That's the autonomous notion being surreptitiously, by drip, 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 pressed upon us. Think about the cult of self-expression and self-fulfillment. Reality TV projects a norm of people expressing themselves in order to be authentic. I'm actually a big fan of inauthenticity. I know that that's wrong to say today, but I like it when people don't tell me exactly what they think about me. I think that helps civilization. There's a reason why we can't all read each other's minds. Society would fall apart at that point. I grew up in the 70s and 80s in the United Kingdom. I had a very traditional education. It was a state school, government-funded school, but it was all boys and very traditional. And we were taught the values of self-restraint and self-control. My parents reinforced them. I remember my mum, when we would go out, my mum would look at me just before we left and she would say, and you need to keep quiet because you are the least interesting person at the gathering today. Today, my mum would be done for child abuse, I'm sure. In those days, that was just her sending the message that you are to behave yourself. You are to restrain yourself. Your wants and desires don't count for anything in this gathering. You're a child and you should act appropriately and respectfully towards your elders. That is not a message that is sent today. that shapes the intuitions of the world in which we live. We also live in what I call an economy of desire, where we are taught that the fulfillment of our personal desires is that which constitutes a good life. I use the example, I think it's in my larger book, not the shorter one. I use the example of my grandfather, and I draw a contrast with myself. My grandfather left school at 14 or 15. He worked for over 50 years in a factory. He had a job that I would regard as a real drudge. And I use the example in my book that, if I ever asked my grandfather, do you get job satisfaction? First of all, he would not have understood the question. I would have to explain to him what I meant, because what I mean by job satisfaction would not have crossed his horizon as being anything of any remote importance whatsoever. Secondly, once I'd explained the question to him, he would answer, yes, because I earned enough money to put bread on the table and shoes on my children's feet. In other words, I earned enough money to fulfill my obligations to those who are naturally dependent upon me. If you ask me that question, my intuitive answer is going to be, yeah, I get a real kick out of standing up in front of a class of students, teaching subjects I enjoy, and seeing light bulbs go on as students get ideas that were once opaque to them and now make perfect sense. My answer is all about how I feel. There is an age of difference between myself and my grandfather. I am of the age of the expressive individual whose life revolves around personal happiness, where all other relations are therefore judged by whether they enhance or inhibit that happiness. All of this is to say, circling back, is that provides the context where the weakest argument becomes the strongest argument, where the philosophical nonsense that the baby in the womb is just part of the woman's body comes to make perfect sense in the imagination, because what's in the woman's body may enhance her happiness or may inhibit her happiness. Either way, that's the key question for deciding the moral status of that which is in the woman's womb. What's the impact of all this then? Well, first, just to recap what I've just said, abortion exists in a culture where it's I would say, one part of a much broader ecology. The question of abortion cannot be isolated from these broader cultural issues. And that's why changes in the law, though to be welcomed, are insufficient as a complete answer. Changes in the law can alter culture. They can change direction. I think, there's a big debate. Is law downstream from culture, or is culture downstream from law? I think it's a bit of both. There's no doubt that law changes culture and culture shapes law. I think it's a sort of chicken and egg. I'm English. I'm bound to go for the middle position, I guess, on that. But no change by the law in itself can change the complete ecology of a culture. And that helps explain, I think, why since the fall of Roe v. Wade, there have been so many tremendous losses, if you like, for the right side in the court of public opinion. The law is one thing, the ecology of public opinion is quite another. I also think it offers us an opportunity, though, and the lady who was speaking before me, I think, was really tapping into this. I think we don't do ourselves a favor if we just see this as kind of, it's just a terrible disadvantage. We're really up against it. I think strategically it behooves us to think about, okay, this is the ecology of the culture in which we live. How do we therefore develop strategies that play to that ecology? And I think we need to understand that expressivist culture, the kind of culture I've described, responds most powerfully to things which play to the emotions. And that can be used to our advantage. That's just a thing in some ways. Whether we care to acknowledge it and act accordingly is down to us. Think about sonograms. Why do sonograms have such a powerful impact? Because suddenly that which is in the womb looks like a human being. It's easier to make the case, the abstract case, that the baby in the womb is a human being when we have specific, concrete examples that reinforce that. Why are the other side so frightened about laws that suggest that women asking for abortions should actually be shown a sonogram before they sign on the dotted line? Because they know the power of the concrete. Each baby in the womb is not an abstraction. It's a person. And anything that points in that direction will be feared by the other side. Again, I say, I think we learn from the opposition here. The way they pivoted to emotional stories straight away gives the game away about the culture. They know that, yeah, we can argue abstractions till the cows come home. But the most powerful things are the individual stories. All of that is to say, maybe we should take a leaf from Oliver O'Donovan's book, from his observation. Maybe our strongest philosophical arguments are not our most powerful suit. Maybe we need to realize that and allow that to profoundly shape our strategy. Thanks very much. I've got a few minutes for questions, and then I think there's a brief break, and then I will come back for round two.
Thank you, Dr. Trueman. That was awesome. All right. So we're going to do some moderating of questions. We got the mic up, and we have the number up again for 412-515-0293 for our virtual audience to be able to ask questions. And anybody in the audience, I believe we have a gentleman over here, Emily.
Good morning, Professor. Will you comment a little bit on how the modern self with emotions, desire, self-fulfillment has also led to sort of a relocation of the totalitarian impulse at the same time, where we're now regulating toasters and speech codes and everything else?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. You know, how is it that this, in some ways, radically libertarian view of the self, autonomous, self-defining, coincides with the rise of some, what we say, politically totalitarian impulses within our culture? I think there are a number of factors that play into that. But at root, there's this, of course. You cannot ultimately have a coherent society where everybody decides who they are individually. It just isn't going to work. There has to be some sort of code for corporate belonging that applies, otherwise everything just descends into anarchy. And the question then becomes, so who makes that decision? And that's when I think we get into questions of political lobbying, et cetera, et cetera. And the political lobbying that's going to work most powerfully is the political lobbying that flows with the culture of the day. And one of the things I'm going to talk about in the second lecture is this, that transgression has a particular cachet today. Didn't really touch on it in this lecture, but one of the things that marks morality today is we've shifted from a moral code based on right and wrong to a moral code based on tradition or transgression. And transgression really carries the day. So what I think we're seeing at the moment is a political class emerging that is enforcing the transgressive at the expense of the traditional. And it's able to do that in ways that were unimaginable even 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, I could also talk, the abolition of the private space through technology is interesting. Suddenly everybody's private opinion on everything is important. When I first started teaching at the University of Nottingham, over 30 years ago now, State University in the UK, the only thing that mattered was whether I was competent in teaching Reformation history. My guess is if I were to apply for that same job today, there would be other criteria. many of which have nothing to do with my competence to teach Reformation history, and everything to do with the kind of conversations I might have in the pub or around the dinner table on a Sunday, or how I cast my vote at election time. And I think that plays back to there is a new moral code that has emerged and is being enforced. On one level, we have to have moral codes to have a society. So which kind of moral codes comport with the ecology of the culture? It's the transgressive ones.
All right, okay. Robbie.
Thank you, Dr. Trueman. Really appreciate your comments. During your talk, my name is Robbie Pruitt from Shepherd's Heart Anglican Church in Diocese Mid-Atlantic. In your talk, you defined basically Gnosticism without labeling it, which is disembodied Christianity. I wonder if that was in your thinking, if you didn't label it on purpose, or if you would say more about a disembodied Christianity and the ways that the church can address that heresy.
Well, here I am going to disagree with my friend Robbie George. Robbie's big on this. It's a new iteration of Gnosticism. I have two hesitations on that front. My first hesitation is, as a historian, I don't want to use terminology that necessarily implies more of a connection than there is. So I don't like the use of this early historic term, applying it to a culture that really is not drawing on Gnostic text or anything. So that's a sort of pedantic historical point. The more substantive point I would make is this. Again, there's an oddly conflicted attitude to the body. On the one hand, the body is subordinate to my inner self. But then the question becomes, okay, let's say that I'm a woman, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. If my body is not important, why do I need my body transformed to conform to my inner identity? And that's where I think the sort of the Gnostic analogy starts to break down. Because it's not that the body is evil as such. It's not that truth lies in a complete way beyond the body. The body still has this peculiar importance. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but it doesn't seem to me quite what, say, the Gospel of Thomas is communicating about bodies. The body is still, it's more raw material than evil, if I could put it that way. And I think that's a bit of a difference between classic Gnosticism. But if you want to use the term, I think there are parallels and analogies, so I certainly wouldn't object to it. I just don't typically use it myself for those reasons. One pedantic, one more substantive.
All righty, I have a question from the virtual audience. How do I raise my kids not be subsumed by individual expressivism?
Tune in for my second lecture. That's when I give all the answers.
I was thinking you might say that.
I think there are some simple, I don't think there's any single silver bullet answer to this. And I think we also have to be realistic. Homeschooling isn't going to be the answer. I mean, it may be part of your answer, but that in itself, in a highly connected, integrated internet world, we cannot run up a mountain and just ignore the rest of the world. So I think we have to prepare our kids to face the world as it really is. I think that requires good teaching. We have to teach them well. But I think it also requires a good, again, I'm going to touch on this in the second lecture. If we're thinking social imaginary terms, it also requires a way of life. Teaching them that bodies are important. Teaching them to discipline their use of the cell phone, for example. And I would say no kid under 16 needs a smartphone. I think if you give your kid a smartphone, it's game over at this point. But teach your kids that bodily interaction is important. Have family meal times. I know with schedules it's not possible every day of the week, but have family meal times is an important part of your, if not daily, at least your weekly routine. Show by example the importance of embodiment. Never prioritize the virtual over the real. So I think there are all kinds of things that one should do that help form the imaginations of our children in a way that is somewhat countercultural.
Any other questions from our audience? Oh, we have somebody.
Hi. Two questions. One, do you have specific examples of Christians who are contributing to the cultural ecology today in rhetorically effective ways? And then two, comparing where we're at today with, say, 30 or 40 years ago, is it an easier time to contribute? I'm just thinking of, even your example of Will of Grace, there's not as much sort of monocultures anymore. You know, we're not all watching the same TV shows. We can kind of have these subsets. So I wonder is it an easier time to contribute now than it was 30, 40, 50?
In a positive or a negative way when you say contribute?
Contribute positively.
Positively.
Yeah.
I certainly think there are opportunities there. I mean, I try to avoid the kind of decline and fall theory of history. I try to take the view, hey, these are the times we live in. Let's work out what the dynamics are and let's operate accordingly. And I certainly don't, you know, my time in the 70s and 80s, I grew up, you know, we grew up in Britain assuming that either the Americans or the Russians were going to vaporize us in a nuclear war. You know, my father grew up, his earliest memories were being rushed to the bomb shelter at the bottom of the garden because the Luftwaffe were trying to kill him, not him personally, but, you know, British people in general on a nightly basis. I certainly don't want to go down the line of it's so much more terrible now. No, it's just different. The challenges are different. The opportunities are different. Are there opportunities to contribute? Yes. I think we need to realize times have changed, though. And that's why one of my mantras has been, and again, this will come out in lecture 2, is I think the church, we need to catechize our own people first. We've been caught off guard by this, but there are great opportunities. There is more good literature available now than there has been for many generations for addressing many of the issues we've got. We stand at a point in history where I think we've become much more acute. If you'd said to me 20 years ago, the transgender question would be the big one in politics, I'd never have believed you. I think we stand at a point in history now where it is easier to see the implications of what's going on, and therefore should, in theory, be easier to start thinking about mounting an answer. So, absolutely, I think we stand at a point in time now where, yes, we can contribute. And one of the interesting things is, going back to the totalitarian question, on the one hand, it seems easier to be totalitarian today because of technology, but I also think it's easier to subvert totalitarianism today because of technology. The worst thing we can do at this point, I think, is despair, because that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It would be a tragedy if all we did was look at the way the world is today and lament. Lamentation is an important part of biblical piety, absolutely. But if all we do is lament, then we miss the many opportunities that might come to us nationally, but more often, I think, locally, individually. So I'm not an optimist, but I'm a realist. I think there's hope. We know that Jesus wins in the end anyway. So let's get on and take the opportunities we have in the context in which we find them.
Question over here. Okay, we can go to the other side. Thanks.
Thank you for your phenomenal lecture today. I wanted to ask if you could comment on a thought about tyranny. Something that I believe I've derived from reading Scripture is that deceit is the lingua franca of tyranny. From the 3rd chapter of Genesis throughout history, the ascendant autocratic authority in a nation has been the group of people that can lie the most effectively. So, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're correct, and I think but I think in some ways what you see on a macro stage there is just the heart of each of us. I think we always need to be careful that we avoid I thank you, Lord, that we're not like, I'm not saying you're saying this, but we need to be aware that what we see in our leaders is there in all of our own hearts. What is sin? Sin is the naturalization of the unnatural. We all do that in our lives. If you're President of the United States, Prime Minister of England, Führer of Nazi Germany, you have greater potential for doing that over more people than anybody else does. But we all have the potential for doing it in our own circles. You know, if you're a pastor, if you spend any time in the pastorate, you quickly come to realize that the nice, happy people you minister to on a Sunday, some pretty terrible stuff going on behind this. I shouldn't laugh, but it's a kind of wow. It's amazing the way people can present themselves on a Sunday and, you know, they're living a lie. So I would say yes, the subversion of reality is it's the age-old sin. We need to be wary of it in our leaders of all political stripes. Put not your trust in princes. I think becomes more true to me as the years go by. But also I think we need to be aware that it isn't just a problem at a national level. It goes right the way down to our own individual hearts.
Mm.